This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hi, I'm Anna Teider, and this is Thank You Mama. My guest today is Dr. Zsuzsa Berend. Hi, Zsuzsa.
Hi, Anna.
Welcome. Are you meowing or is your cat meowing?
Oh, no, it was my cat, sorry.
It's okay.
All right, okay.
Zsuzsa was born and raised in Budapest in Hungary and moved to the US in the mid-80s. Zsuzsa is a professor of sociology at UCLA and a mother of two grown-up boys. Zsuzsa, how old are they?
Oh, Benjamin just turned 30 on the 11th, and Daniel is going to be 27 soon in December.
And Zsuzsa also, as you can hear, has a cat. What's her name?
I have actually two, and one is Flip and one is Mew.
Okay, who's talking to us?
They stopped talking to us, and now they're talking to each other.
Okay. Among other topics, Zsuzsa, your research deals with the intersection of personal and contractual relationships, and you published a book called The Online World of Surrogacy, in which you analyzed surrogates' own posts and discussions to try to conceptualize what it means to be a surrogate. Yes. So my thought was, this is amazing because we are talking about mothers here and you've researched mothers. But as you corrected me, these women do not consider themselves mothers. Is that right?
Yes, very much so. They are supporting the so-called intended parenthood. So they think that their desire for a child, for a family, makes them parents. And then, of course, the subsequent raising of the children makes them parents. Sometimes, of course, it's the intended parent's genetic material. But even when it's donor material, donor X, for example, they still say that it's the intended parents who are the parents and not them. They just help them become a family.
It's fascinating to me. Having become a mother and having carried a child for 9 months in my belly, it's a fascinating topic to me. You know, from what moment on do you feel as a mother?
Yes, and I think in a way, it's because we wanted those children, our children, right? And so in some sense, I came to realize that we take it so for granted when we're pregnant with our children, right? Those of us who, wanted the children, but even people who got pregnant by accident usually embrace the idea that it's their child and they now want it. And it's a very powerful thing that our brain does. We just don't see it that way, right? Because at that time we are one with our brain and our body. But these surrogates are not. They say that my brain tells me that this is not my child, and I actually got into this whole process knowing that it's someone else's child, and that's why I agreed to carry this baby, because I understand how important children and families are. So from the get-go, they don't think of themselves as mothers, not even as biological mothers, if they are traditional surrogates or birth mothers in any way or shape or form. They consider themselves helpful, giving women who want to make other people's dreams come true. Of course, there's a little bit of a sentimentalized version here, but still, in some basic way, it's true.
Zsuzsa, this is so fascinating to me, and it's a topic for a whole other episode of a podcast for my next for the next podcast. But let's go back to our mamas. Let's go back to your mama. Mama Rosa, will you introduce your Mama Rosa?
Yes, so my mom, Rosa, was born in what is now Ukraine, which at one point belonged to Hungary or to Czechoslovakia, depending on what time period we're talking about. But so it's the Carpathian region of Ukraine. And so she was one of 6 children, the youngest girl, and then she had a younger brother. And her mother's sister didn't have children. She and her husband lived in Budapest and had a store. They owned a shop and would visit in the summers. And in the summer of 1936, when my mother was 6 years old, they told her that she would go live with them in a big house in Budapest. And what became maybe not so clear, but somewhat clearer as she was an adult, that her parents agreed to adopt her. I mean, it wasn't ever a formal adoption because it was in the family, but they agreed that the sister and her husband would take my mother as their daughter and visit in the summers or whatever agreement they made. And then my mother, because, she read many fairy tales and princess stories, and she was telling her friends, and that's what she told me, that she thought she was going to be a princess living in a palace in Budapest, because the big house made her kind of associate with that it was a palace. And then when she arrived, she was extremely disappointed because it was just an apartment building, and she wasn't a princess. And then for some years, maybe just a couple of years, they would visit in the summer, but then the war started and they could no longer visit. So she never saw her parents again because they were killed in Auschwitz with her youngest brother. And the family, that the aunt and uncle, then maybe, I don't know exactly when this little girl, Agnes, was born, but they had their own daughter a few years after my mother went to live with them. So she wasn't an only child, and she wasn't treated quite as their child, is what she told me. She would help with the household chores. She would then later help out in the store. And she said, and that's kind of a heart-wrenching thing, that she always got the smallest piece of cake when there was some kind of a celebration. And so she stayed in Budapest, and her aunt and the little girl went into hiding because they weren't sure what was the safest thing to do in 1944 after the German invasion. And they knew someone in a village, in a very small village, that agreed, of course, in exchange for payment to hide them, and they had false papers. And as dumb luck would have it, someone from the house that they lived in was a relative of someone in the village, in a tiny village, and went to visit, and he recognized my mother's aunt and denounced them to the police, and they were deported to Auschwitz and died there. And the uncle was called into this forced labor service, as men between 16 and 60 from Budapest were called into forced labor. And so he had various deployments, so to speak, but then he did come back after he, of course, realized that his wife and child were killed. He remarried and left the country in 1946, leaving my mother.
And she was very young. How old was she?
She was 14. She was 14. And so I think these successive, of course, it's my luxury to analyze these things, these successive abandonments left a huge trauma. And my mother, of course, was very creative, and she was hiding in the last months of the war when her uncle was still in this forced labor unit. She rented a bed, and she was hiding, but hiding with false papers that she arranged for herself, going to the police and saying, they were not false, they were real papers, but based on a lie. She said that because there were so many refugees from that Carpathian region during that time, as the Soviets were advancing, that she said she got separated from her parents, and she gave a false name.
Which was not Jewish, in order to survive.
Which was not Jewish, exactly. And she didn't look Jewish. She had long brown braids and a straight nose and big brown eyes. So she looked like just a regular girl. She could be from anywhere. And she apparently was a good actress because she pulled it off. And so she survived that way. And then when after the war ended, Budapest was liberated, she went back to the apartment, and then she met, of course, was reunited with the uncle, but not for too long, because the uncle then remarried and left for the U.S. Really not leaving my mother with much, and he sold the apartment because they needed money to leave. And so my mother found herself basically without anything, but with the new government and new opportunities. She finished high school, she enrolled in a university, and she got scholarship. She was staying in the dorms, and she was very active and very enthusiastic to embark in this new life. So for a while, it didn't look like she was traumatized, although obviously it left very, very deep marks on her.
And then she got married.
Yeah, so she met my father when she was 16, and so they were in some kind of a drama thing together. They acted in plays, so maybe my mother was a good actress, and then they went to university, and then they got married afterward. So two sisters who survived, one actually came back from Auschwitz and the other one was in hiding, who left also in 46 or something like that, and they sent someone back to bring my mother. It was maybe 48. She was 18, and they sent someone to marry her, and with false, kind of pretenses to marry her, or like a fake marriage. And that person was to get her out and take her to Canada, where my two aunts lived. But my mother refused because she was already deeply in love with my father, and she had, just enrolled in university, and she thought she really had a life and a future in Hungary. And these were sisters she didn't know too well because she left when she was 6. So, she knew them to some extent, but not intimately, not that well. So I think maybe that was part of it, that she just couldn't imagine herself in Canada, and while at the same time she had this life in Budapest. After the graduation, they got married, and then they lived with my grandparents, my father's parents, for a while. And I was born, and my mother was teaching. My father was at the university also teaching. So they were busy. They were very busy.
And then your sister was born, and you told me she fell into depression she actually never recovered from.
Yeah. So when my sister was born, things were really going well in a way. My father was writing books. My mother was teaching. I was getting a little more independent. So, we had our own apartment by then, and things were easier, I think. And my mother always wanted a bigger family, at least, another kid. And I think it was partly that she thought that the timing was okay then, but I think partly she also was sensing that I was getting more independent. My father was getting, also more involved in work, and maybe with other women. Maybe there was a possibility that he would be attracted to other women. And so she wanted to cement the family as well. And I'm not saying it as a mean intention on her part, but I think it wasn't simply wanting another child and a sister or brother for me, which of course she said was the reason. She said I was the only reason that she decided to have my sister, because I wanted a sibling. So it was put on me. And then when my sister was born, my father had it was a Ford Foundation scholarship to the U.S., so he left for 8 months. And I think my mother plunged into this depression, partly because it was really hard to have a baby again, and it was hard because she was torn, because my father wanted her to go and spend maybe a few months in the U.S. with him. So, in fact, she actually did go. When my sister was 8 months old, she went for 2.5 months to the U.S. And so all these things didn't help. And so she was burdened with guilty feelings and torn, and also realized that it wasn't the same, the fairy tale family, that now finally there's a second baby, that there's a sister for me, because I had to take care of my sister in so many different ways, and it also interfered with their life in major ways. So it was kind of hard for her, I think.
How old were you, Zsuzsa, when your sister was born?
So I was 11, and then while they were in the U.S., my grandmother and grandfather were, staying with us. But then my grandfather had glaucoma, so he was depressed because he couldn't see, and my grandmother actually had cancer. So I called the family doctor, reporting that there was something majorly wrong with my grandmother, and my mother came back a little bit earlier than she would have, and then my father came back also somewhat earlier, a little bit later on. So the whole thing ended in some kind of a real drama, and those were really difficult months, because I felt I was in charge, and and everyone around me had some really major issues. And as a child, I had to kind of grow up and deal with that. And then, of course, I think my mother was also feeling guilty for putting me in that situation. So, and then it was just a mess, right? But she just never really recovered from that depression, and then it got much worse over the years.
Zsuzsa, I really want to quote. I wrote it down, and I think it's a very important question. When we talked about this interview, you actually said at one point, you asked, are we ever equipped to be mothers? Mm-hmm. Which I thought it was a very, very interesting thought. And hearing your mother's story, I would think she had so many experiences, deep, big experiences of abandonment and suffering and struggle and survival, that of course she would be equipped to be a mother. But then you tell me you learned from her in a different way, actually.
Yes, I think so. Because of course, before we have kids, we just don't know, right? We don't know. I mean, we see other people being mothers, although she didn't really see too many people in that sense in her family or otherwise, right? So, but I think what she wanted was a secure, safe, warm family that she never really had. So she was willing to, immerse herself in that. But then when she had me, there were too many problems with, my grandparents living there, work, political situation. And when she had my sister, it was a whole other range of things. So, it was never that dream that she had in mind, I think, in some way. And of course, it's never quite that for us or anyone, I think. But we usually, in these present times, have children under different conditions.
Does this connect to what you mentioned as the most important lesson you learned with her? The fact that she did not deal with things.
So she, and I think in her generation, so many people decided that the only thing they could do is to move on. And as I later realized, it of course meant that they really couldn't face the horrible things that happened to them. There's no easy way to deal with that sort of trauma or to work through that sort of trauma. And then, of course, my mother actually didn't believe in that in the first place. And that's part of the mechanism, I think, with which she distanced herself from all that. What she told me was that, well, people outgrow these traumas, meaning that just time, and you do your things and you do other things in life, and then it just goes away, and it's just a thing that happened in the past. So the way she could deal with it was to bury it and to not really think about it, or when she not really talk about it. She said to me that her uncle, whom he called Daddy, didn't want to abandon her, but the second wife was a bitch, and so she persuaded him. So, this kind of thing helps, right? Because it's not their fault. It's not the people who are close to you that hurt you. It's something else. It's the conditions. It's other people. And so she didn't believe in the durability of trauma, and therefore never really dealt with it. And I think she threw herself into a new life, which was also teaching and being a mother and being a wife, also fairly prominently there for my father. She didn't really have friends. So it was just this shielding herself from the past with the present in a way.
Which we discussed then came back to her in the severe depression she suffered from.
Yes, and I really later on thought that it was definitely connected, and maybe she had regrets about certain things. Maybe the timing of the second child. I don't know, but it was hard for her, harder than she thought, and maybe that's when all this undealt with trauma also came back more full force, and she never really was the same after that. There were years when she was in a very deep depression, like sometimes kind of not being able to get up and not being able to take care of herself or others. So her personality to some extent changed even when she was no longer in that deep depression. She was very, very anxious, which I didn't even know as a child, because that was just normal for me to have a mother like that. But it left very deep marks, I think, on her.
Zsuzsa, and do you think you are doing it differently? Did you learn from that and learn to deal with things?
So, your initial question at what we learned from our mothers, I felt, when I thought about it, not that I didn't know it before, but when I thought about it in this framework, I realized that I can't really say anything that I learned from her directly. That was such a good lesson that I learned. I think all the things I have done as a mother, and all the things that I also just do as a person, were kind of lessons that I drew from her behavior and from the way she dealt with things or didn't deal with things. Of course, I mean, that's a kind of exaggeration, but I really think, and it's a chilling thought, that it was kind of a template to work out my strategy against.
But isn't that fascinating, Zsuzsa? And I'm very excited when people understand, when my guests understand my point of asking, what was your mom not able to teach you? Because it's fascinating when we think about it, how we learn also through things that they didn't do well. It's easy to say, oh, I haven't learned anything from my mother. But as we are talking about your mom now, you've learned a lot just through a negative template, so to say.
Yes, I have learned a lot, and I'm actually happy about that, right? Because, I mean, given her past, and probably she didn't even understand, of course, her own actions or behavior in that deep sense, but she was overprotective, very, very protective when I was a child, and also with my sister, which I saw then as a kind of, older kid. But with me, I remember I was just, people, my mother and my father would describe that I was very, very shy, and I would hide behind my mother, and I would burst out crying, and they kind of thought it was maybe slightly amusing, or I don't know, like certainly as I grew up, it was more amusing than when I was actually terrified of everything. But they kind of, I think, thought, okay, here's a shy, very, very shy kid, and that's what it is. And then she'll grows out of it, just like we grow out of trauma. And then I realized I was so shy. I was so terrified. When I went to school at age 7, I was just crying through the first day, and I couldn't help it. And I was so ashamed of myself because no one else was crying. And over the years, I realized that I just never felt safe. And this overprotectiveness, I think, what the message was, that you're not safe. I have to, as your mother, protect you all of the time, or else horrible things will happen. And I think that may have been my mother's deep sense of how the world is, without, of course, reflecting on it, or actually even, thinking of any concrete dangers, because there were no concrete dangers. But that was her sense of the world. I mean, I then was overprotected from everything in a way that made me extremely vulnerable and extremely afraid. And that's one thing I didn't do with my kids, because I actually reflected on it when I had Benjamin, because my first instinct was to just wrap my arms around him and never let go. And then I kind of saw, thinking back, I saw myself as a child, I saw my mother, and then I saw myself with Benjamin. And I thought, no, the best thing I can give him, and of course I lived at a different time, I had a different past, is this sense that he's okay. He's okay when he's not with me. And it took me a while to leave him with anyone else. But then he went to school when he was 3 years old, and we had neighbors and friends that he knew very well, and he would play with kids. And I realized when he went into a new situation, there were a bunch of kids as a party type of thing. It wasn't a real party, but, there were lots of kids playing, and then the adults were in this other room. And he just went with a kid who took his hand, whom he didn't know, into this other room to play with Legos. And I was happy. And maybe other people don't don't even realize because it's normal for a kid to play. But for me, it was this major victory that I achieved over myself, you know?
But Zsuzsa, I think it's generally a mothering problem, being overprotective. It's my guess that we have this natural instinct to protect our children.
Yeah.
And unless the situation puts us in a situation where we have to let go, we have to consciously do this. And I see that with me and with Kai. I really have to consciously be like, no, he'll be okay by himself. And if I cling to him, I'm just doing him a disservice, like you just described. So it's fighting your natural instinct in a way.
Right. But I mean, a lot of people also leave their children with trusted babysitters or trusted others. And I had a really hard time doing that. And so I had to struggle against myself. And I think it was maybe a more conscious effort. I mean, I'm not saying it's not for other people, but I know I remember, right? I remember how hard it was and how much I actually thought that I achieved the victory over myself when he went into this other room with this other kid to play and didn't even look back. Daniel was more difficult. He would cry and he would be more clingy. But this kind of sense that you have to project that they're okay and not look panicked when they're panicked, that sort of thing. And you have to kind of convince yourself because otherwise it's very hard to pretend, right? I mean, it's hard to pretend that I know you'll be okay. This is just fine, and I'm okay. And if you deeply feel that it's wrong to leave the kid or it's wrong to not be able to protect him, then it's harder to pull off.
Zsuzsa, do you think we can get overly protective over ourselves in the same way as we can with children?
True. I think my mother, she protected herself in a way that was like, she almost never went to see a doctor. She basically had to faint to be taken to a doctor because she didn't want anyone, she had this bubble around her in a way, and as long as she was in control of other people, like children or her class or her, curriculum or whatever it was, she could not easily delegate. I never thought of that this way, but I think it may be also related to this. It was just trying to be in control of the children who are my children, but also in control of herself and pretty much she didn't have close friends. She and my father had friends, but they were my father's friends, and she never really was close to anyone. I talked to her about that later on in life, and she never had close girlfriends, for example, that she married.
It's unimaginable to me.
I know, to me too. And so she didn't discuss anything really with anyone, not even my father, I think.
Zsuzsa, but I'd like to go to one other point you mentioned. You already mentioned fairy tales.
Yes, right.
She read fairy tales and loved fairy tales, and it was interesting. You told me that she raised you projecting fairy tale endings, that if you do things in a certain way, life will be good, which is fascinating for me, especially coming from somebody who experienced that you cannot have control over life, that sometimes shit happens.
Yeah, so I think it was very striking, and then later on my sister and I talked about that. My mother's general response to things when we were complaining about something or were unhappy about something, her general response was that if you do the right thing or if you choose the right way, everything will be fine. So she kind of projected this sense of control over your fate or the future. Well, maybe not control, but like things will be rewarded almost. That if you do this, then that will happen and that will be a good thing. And it's kind of a reward for good behavior. But it also, in a way, is connected to then you did it, therefore you deserve it. And that was this kind of sense that everything will work out fine, that everything will be going well as a kind of end result. And her whole sense that there is some kind of you just have to settle down to do whatever and then it'll be fine. And so she was always worried when I, ended the relationship that now what? Because I was about to be settled in a good way. And that, so Of course, she wanted security, but it also conveyed a lack of trust in me. It conveyed that somehow, unless I do certain things, I mess up. So I think that fairy tale and this kind of looming sense that I'll mess up, they were always connected. Only later did I realize. But the fairy tale endings that she projected, and then also my sister later on said the same thing, that first it was kind of just infuriating, because you knew, even as a child, that that's just kind of not how things are. But you wanted them to be that way. And as you grew up, you realize they're really not that way at all. And then you feel taken in, you were lied to, you were misled. And not just because she said that, but because you believed it. And that was how we both felt, that we believed it. We were promised this. And of course, it's not like that. And we can't even be mad at her because, it wasn't her doing that things don't work out. But just that promise misleads you. And then that was just a really hard thing in a way. I remember when my kids were young. I mean, they were, maybe 5 and came home from a play date, and Benjamin, I remember, was sitting on the stairs and said something about how things are not fair because he wanted to play more, and then there was not enough time. And I just got really angry, and I said, "Who said life is fair?" And I remember for Benjamin, his eyes grew so big, and I said, "Oh my God, what am I doing?" But I think I was just almost violently overreacting to my mother, actually, right? That no fairy tales. No, we're not going to pretend that life is fair. And yes, get on with the program, get used to that. And then, of course, I softened my stance and I said, "So tell me what happened and why you couldn't play." But my initial thing was not that, oh, everything will be fine, but that who said life is fair.
But it's such a huge part of growing up and learning life. And what happened to me as well. I got married, and 2 months later, Nick got diagnosed with his first cancer. And then 2 years later, we had a baby. And 6 months later, the cancer came back. That's life. And it's such a big part of growing up, learning that no, there are no fairy tales, And I do believe that if you're raised that way from early on, then it's easier to deal with it. But what fascinates me is that she who witnessed that life was not a fairy tale created this construct, and I wonder if she wanted to believe this. She wanted to believe that the Second World War and everything that happened was such an extraordinary thing. But if that doesn't exist, then if you do the fairy tale things, the fairy tale ending will happen. That it kind of, what you talked about, projected control over your life.
Yeah, I'm sure that she couldn't have lived with that assumption that things can just happen again, or things can happen to her kids that are the kinds of things that happened to her. I mean, obviously that wasn't really in the cards in a literal way, but I think she just couldn't think of it. She just couldn't deal with it. I think she would have dissolved into what she actually did in this depression. But, and so I think that this kind of undealt with trauma, and maybe that kind of trauma is not the kind of trauma that people can deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's so extraordinary, but she clearly had to, I think, to herself as well as to us. When people come up with these kinds of fairy tales, it's never just for other people's consumption. It's for themselves. Absolutely, as well. Yeah. And so I was very conscious of that when I had kids, more than before, I think, just because before I could say that, well, I don't believe these things, and I still kind of did, because it's nice to believe that everything will work out, right?
It is.
But I didn't want to perpetuate that. I didn't want my kids to grow up with that sort of promise from me,
Mm-hmm.
And that just, I guess in a way what I was trying to tell them is that we have to deal with things, and maybe we can solve some of our problems, hopefully, but it's not going to be solved somehow miraculously or work out miraculously. Yeah, it's really hard because, yes, in a way, of course, that's what you want for your kid.
But it's interesting. Now we came back to the first topic we discussed in the beginning, which is deal with things.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it nice, Zsuzsa, how we just circled back to the beginning?
Going in circles.
Zsuzsa, thank you so much for talking to me. This was absolutely fascinating, and I think we all learned a lot from Mama Rosa.
I know, it's really sad, isn't it? But also kind of nice.
It's sad, but I think it's beautiful that we give it life through thinking about it and analyzing it and trying to make things better. I think that's what matters at the end.
Yes, and understanding. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Zsuzsa.
Thank you so much, Anna.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Tajder, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.